a pistol hidden in the confessional, and a priest who swears he heard it whisper before it fired. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. There were few things in Flaxborough more dependable than the air of pious boredom that settled over St. Botolph's every Sunday morning. The choir, consisting chiefly of the underemployed and over-enthusiastic, managed their anthem with the same air of weary duty as the verger wielded his broom. Even the Almighty, it was occasionally remarked, seemed inclined to doze until the organist struck his final, faltering chord. Thus, it was not the service that disturbed the town that mild April morning, but the events that followed it. Mrs. Viney, who cleaned the church with the same vigor she applied to moral hygiene, was the first to find the gun. She discovered it in the confessional, a handsome old oak box, seldom used, except by children too timid to confess directly to the vicar, and by certain ladies who preferred their sins to remain matters of euphemism. It was a revolver, an ugly, utilitarian thing. Foreign-looking, Mrs. Viney told everyone later, though her familiarity with firearms was derived entirely from the cinema. It lay on the worn leather seat like something that had no business in a house of God, still less among the penitents of Flaxborough. Mrs. Viney, having stared long enough to be sure that it was not a theatrical prop, marched out of the church with a rigidity that suggested both outrage and fear. The vicar, Reverend Crispin Tooley, was found in the vestry polishing his spectacles and preparing, in a manner that was his habit, to worry about nothing in particular. "A gun," she declared, "in the confessional of all places." Reverend Tooley blinked. "A gun? Yes, vicar, loaded for all I know, right there, where good Christians come to unburden their wickedness." The vicar regarded her uncertainly, as though half inclined to suggest she might have misidentified a candle snuffer, but Mrs. Viney's formidable stance convinced him otherwise. Together they ventured to the confessional, where Tooley's mild curiosity stiffened into alarm. "Good heavens," he murmured. "Well, that's most irregular." News, like mildew, spread swiftly in damp places. By tea-time, the tale of the pistol in the pew, as it was by then known, had travelled from the churchyard to the market square, thence through the cafes, and finally into the back parlours of respectable Flaxborough. At the library, Miss Teatime suggested with an arch smile that perhaps someone had sought absolution in anticipation of a crime yet to come. Mr. Harcourt, the chemist, preferred to believe it was one of the army cadets being foolish. Mrs. Glossop, whose imagination was as well fed as her tabby cat, declared it a clear sign of political assassination, possibly involving the mayor. By early evening, Inspector Purbright, who had been reading quietly at his desk when the call came, closed his book and sighed. Crimes in Flaxborough, when they appeared at all, tended to be ill-bred affairs, domestic, embarrassing, and seldom well thought out. Still, there was something about the idea of a gun in a confessional that seemed at once too theatrical and too deliberate to ignore. When Purbright arrived at St. Botolph's, the light had faded to a watery grey that seeped through the stained glass and made the saints look vaguely ill. Sergeant Malley was already there, peering into the confessional with the air of a man checking whether his boots were clean enough for holy ground. "Evening, sir," Malley said. "Here it is. Reverend says he's never seen the thing before." Purbright regarded the revolver without touching it. "Nor, I imagine, has Mrs. Viney," he murmured. "And yet she seems to have formed the firm opinion that it belongs to a foreigner." Malley looked puzzled. "How's that, sir?" "Because it looks different, Sergeant. And in Flaxborough, anything different is foreign, especially when it's alarming." He stepped back, hands behind his back, considering. "No sign of disturbance?" "None, sir. Doors were locked after service, as usual. Reverend says only he, Mrs. Viney, and young Mr. Hoe have keys." Purbright nodded, his eyes moving from the confessional to the rows of empty pews. The church smelled faintly of polish, flowers, and old secrets. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose we must begin our inquiries in the usual way, by asking everyone who insists they know nothing." Mally grinned faintly. "And if it turns out someone's used it, sir?" Purbright's eyes twinkled behind his spectacles. "Then, Sergeant, I expect we shall hear about it before the collection is counted." That night, the church lay silent again. Yet in the stillness, the shadow of the confessional seemed darker than before, and in some quiet corner of Flaxborough, someone who knew very well where that gun had come from was already planning what to do next. The vicar locked the vestry door twice that night and once again in the morning, a performance that reassured nobody, least of all himself. By mid-morning, St. Botolph's resumed its weekday shabbiness, a mop like a penitent's staff, hymn numbers like cryptic arithmetic, a tang of polish. Mrs. Viney arrived early, inspected the confessional with a glare reserved for questionable upholstery, and, finding it empty of all but conscience, declared this a mercy and a warning. Reverend Tooley thanked Providence with an anxious cough and resolved to keep his spectacles polished. Firmness could follow if it would. Inspector Purbright preferred coffee to drama and took both at the Market Cafe, where gossip arrived hot and unasked. He sat by the window with Sergeant Mally. The proprietor, Mr. Glubb, cultivated that confidential manner in which everything was told to be a secret and therefore available at once. "It'll be the cadets, sir," Mally ventured, "or them reenactment people." "Highwaymen," Purbright said, "rarely use confessional boxes." Glubb leaned close. "Word is, Reverend Tooley's had letters, anonymous and unchristian. And what do they say, according to those who haven't read them? That he's soft or covering for someone. Wouldn't surprise me if the pistol's a warning." "From whom?" "That," Glubb said, "depends on who needs warning." They left the cafe to find Miss Teatime at the library window like a conscientious explanation. "I suppose," she said, "the church is safer than some houses. Heaven knows where people keep their firearms." "Does the vicar have enemies?" Purbright asked. "My dear Inspector, a clergyman accumulates enemies as gently as parishioners. He discourages the wrong enthusiasm, neglects the right grievance. Last month he suggested the Mothers' Union might sing less loudly. And the letters? Miss Beasley reports handwriting of the narrow, pinched persuasion. Someone who believes good manners are weakness. The day offered witnesses like small fish flicking into a net. Mr. Harcourt, the chemist, recalled selling surgical spirit to a lanky youth. Mrs. Glossop heard two men arguing near the Lich Gate after evensong. The quarrel, being indistinct, was obviously about money. At the ironmongery, Mr. Weald favoured a stout hasp, preferably British. Purbright walked back to the church. Reverend Tooley was in the vestry, studying baptism registers as though the babies might offer alibis. "Inspector, I hope you've had your tea," he said. "May I see the letters?" Tooley produced a battered biscuit tin. Inside lay 3 folded pages cut from different pads, each narrowed by cramped script. The letters accused the vicar of indulgence toward unnamed wrongdoers. They spoke of scandal covered with hymn tunes. They advised repentance elsewhere with a zeal that hinted at shortage nearer home. None were signed. All were composed by someone whose schooling had favored copybook virtue over charity. "You told no one." "I did not wish to encourage a bully," Tooley said, "nor to be laughed at." "We do not laugh," Purbright replied. "Who has keys besides you and Mrs. Viney?" "Mr. Howe, the curate. He's energetic. He says we must modernize to appeal to the young." "Where is he?" "At the parish hall. They have drums." The parish hall emitted a rhythm of charitable thunder. Mr. Howe, a pale young man with the eyes of a reproachful spaniel, greeted Purbright. "A gun in the confessional. Appalling, but also," he bit his lip, curiously theatrical. "You have a key?" "Of course. for emergencies and extra services. I often lock up. The Reverend is trusting. Everyone is, Purbright said, but rarely the whole of it. I was at the hospital Tuesday evening, Howe added quickly. Pastoral visit. There's a boy with tonsillitis. You can check. I shall. Have you heard of letters to the Reverend? He turned his key ring. He mentioned unpleasantness. I told him to give them to you. He dislikes trouble. Yet he has it. Purbright glanced at stacked chairs and a notice begging cakes. Do you ever use the confessional? Me? Good heavens, no. As Purbright left, the drum thudded again, a passable imitation of destiny's knock. Outside, late light laid a tired gold on the gravestones. Somewhere in town, a gossip adjusted a detail to suit a friend. Elsewhere, a misgiving put on its hat and went out to see what might be done. The day had offered noise, but one remark from Miss Teatime lingered like a pin left carelessly on a chair. Someone who treated manners as weakness. Purbright, who regarded courtesy as armor, made a private note and, because habit served him better than inspiration, set about checking keys, doors, and times. He did not yet know whose warning the pistol represented, but he felt, as one feels the first coolness before rain, that it had been delivered to the wrong man on purpose, and that its author would be obliged to speak again. By the following morning, Flaxborough had done what it did best, turned mystery into routine. The gun was now the church affair, a phrase spoken with the same resigned familiarity as the bypass scheme or Mrs. Glossop's shingles. But under the surface hum of repetition, Inspector Purbright felt a quiet, purposeful movement. Someone was adjusting themselves to the new reality, a person for whom the discovery had not been unexpected but inconvenient. He began his day at the police station, where Sergeant Malley was already bent over a ledger, the sort of record-keeping that suggested both efficiency and prayer. "Report from the armourer, sir," Malley said, handing over a sheet. "Belgian make, .32 caliber, probably pre-war. No fingerprints worth keeping, just a few smudges." Purbright studied the note. "Belgian," he murmured. "A pacifist's weapon, if such exists. How very inconveniently foreign." He set the paper down, thoughtful. "And nothing reported stolen?" "Nothing yet. I checked with the gunsmiths in the next county. Nobody's missing one like it." Purbright nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the station window, where the faint outline of St. Botolph's tower could be seen above the rooftops. "We must ask ourselves, Sergeant, who among our pious citizens is both cautious enough to hide a weapon and foolish enough to choose the confessional as a cupboard?" Malley, frowning, said, "Could have been someone meaning to get rid of it. Hide it where nobody looks." Purbright smiled faintly. "A comforting thought, but too neat. The confessional is private. Yes, but not forgotten. One might bury a conscience there, but not a revolver." He reached for his hat. "Come along, Malley. I believe our Reverend's tea-time visitor yesterday may yet have something to add." They found Reverend Tooley arranging chrysanthemums in a chipped vase, a gesture both peaceful and untidy. "Ah, Inspector," he said with an apologetic smile. "I had a caller last evening, Mr. Cribshaw, the churchwarden. He seemed most perturbed that the matter had gone public, as he put it." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Cribshaw is a man who enjoys the air of discretion without ever practicing it. What disturbed him exactly?" Tooley hesitated. "He suggested, very delicately, that the matter might reflect poorly upon the vestry committee. As he put it, a scandal in the sanctuary is a stain on us all. He even asked whether I had thought to keep the discovery quiet." Purbright's tone remained mild. "And had you?" "Good heavens, no. I may be timid, Inspector, but I'm not negligent." Purbright's eyes glinted. "Quite so. Still, it's interesting that Mr. Cribshaw feared the scandal more than the gun." Outside, a cold wind moved through the churchyard, rattling the gate latch. Purbright walked a little way down the path, his coat collar turned up. "Sergeant," he said softly, There are two types of townsmen who fear publicity: the guilty and the socially ambitious. Mr. Cribshaw, I suspect, is a little of both. By noon, they were at Cribshaw's office, a narrow suite above the estate agent's, smelling faintly of varnish and neglected paperwork. Mr. Cribshaw received them with the solemn cheerfulness of a man accustomed to funerals that didn't involve him. His waistcoat bore a pattern as complex as his conscience, and both were equally tightly buttoned. "A terrible business, Inspector," he said, sighing through his nose. "I'm sure the church will recover, though the papers mustn't get hold of it. Bad for donations, you understand." Purbright inclined his head. "We shall do our best to spare your offertory, Mr. Cribshaw. You keep a key to the church, I believe?" "Indeed, yes. As churchwarden, I have that privilege." "And you were in the church after service on Sunday?" Cribshaw blinked. "I may have stepped in briefly, yes, to ensure the heating was off. I take a personal interest." "I'm sure you do," said Purbright evenly. "Did you notice the confessional then?" No, I would never. That is to say, it's not my habit to intrude upon the, private fittings of worship." Purbright's gaze was steady. "Of course not. And the letters Reverend Tooley received, were you aware of them?" Cribshaw's face froze in polite horror. "Letters? Anonymous ones?" "I most certainly was not." Purbright regarded him for a moment longer, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Cribshaw. You've been most clear." As they left, Malley muttered, "I don't trust him, sir." "Trust, Sergeant," said Purbright, "is like tea, too strong, and it becomes undrinkable. Let us instead observe how often Mr. Cribshaw refills the pot." They crossed the market square, where wind tugged at awnings and gossip hung like laundry. Two elderly ladies near the butter stall were discussing the foreign weapon, in tones that suggested the French were once again behaving badly. Purbright paused just long enough to catch a phrase that Miss Peebles and her choir practice, always after dark, before continuing toward the parish hall. Inside, the air was thick with polish and feminine determination. Miss Peebles, who ran the choir and most other moral institutions, turned from the piano. "Inspector, you'll be wanting something dreadful, no doubt." "Only the truth, Miss Peebles. Do your rehearsals keep the hall open late?" "Till 9:30 most nights," she said. "We leave the door on the latch for Mr. Howe. He comes and goes for his sermons and such like. He says it's good for the youth to feel the church is accessible." "Very enlightened," Purbright murmured. "Tell me, on Sunday evening after service, was anyone still about?" Miss Peebles frowned, recalling, "I was last to leave. Mr. Hoof was locking up, I think. At least I heard his voice." "Speaking to whom?" She shook her head. "Couldn't say, but he sounded vexed." When they stepped back into the fading daylight, Malley said, "Looks like young Huff again, sir." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, gazing toward the spire, pale against the lowering sky. "Or perhaps someone wishes us to think so. In Flaxborough, motives tend to borrow other people's coats." He began walking, hands deep in his pockets, thoughts turning not to the curate, but to the quiet, clipped phrases of those letters, written by someone who believed righteousness was a kind of ownership. Somewhere among the choir songs, committee meetings, and tidy gardens of Flaxborough, a moral crusader had armed themselves, quite literally, and Purbright meant to know why. By Wednesday, Flaxborough had settled into that industrious calm which follows the first tremor of excitement, the townsfolk having decided that since the gun had not yet gone off, it was unlikely to do so now. The matter was therefore deemed safe for conversation. At the Market Café, theories had acquired the stability of folklore. Mrs. Glossop confided to her neighbor that it was surely something to do with the Catholics, despite there being none within 20 miles. Mr. Harcourt favored a smuggling connection. Mr. Glubb, more pragmatic, believed it was just somebody's temper mislaid. Inspector Purbright, who preferred facts to folklore, had spent the morning comparing key holders' statements. A discrepancy, modest but persistent, had begun to trouble him, one of those small, stubborn details that refuse to lie down. According to Reverend Tooley, young Mr. Hoof had visited the hospital on Tuesday evening. The hospital's matron, however, when politely questioned, had no recollection of the curate at all. No clergyman that night, she said. Not unless he came through the window, which would be most irregular. Purbright had thanked her with grave courtesy and walked back through the drizzle, the faintest smile forming beneath his umbrella. A curate who misplaced his alibi was either a fool or a man with a pressing reason to lie. In Flaxborough, the difference was rarely absolute. That afternoon, the inspector's path led him once more to the parish hall. The choir's voices carried through the thin wooden door, earnest, flat, and unshakably optimistic. When he entered, Miss Peebles broke off mid-hymn with the air of a martyr interrupted during canonization. "Inspector, another inquiry, I suppose." "Merely a clarification," Purbright said mildly. "On Sunday evening, you heard Mr. House speaking before you left." "Yes, at least I thought so." "Could it have been anyone else?" Her lips pursed in moral disapproval. "In the parish hall, Inspector, we assume the best until proven otherwise. But if you're asking whether I'd stake my housekeeping on it, no, I would not." Purbright thanked her and left, pausing at the corner of the churchyard where the damp grass carried faint footprints. He bent to inspect them. Small, narrow impressions, close together, leading from the vestry door toward the lich gate. A woman's, perhaps. Mrs. Viney's boots were larger and practical. Miss Peebles would never have trodden over graves after dusk. He made a mental note and straightened slowly, hearing the bell of St. Botolph's toll the half-hour, an oddly hollow sound, as though echoing through doubt. At the vicarage, Reverend Tooley received him with nervous kindness. The man looked thinner, as if guilt, borrowed or otherwise, had dieted his conscience. "Ah, Inspector," he said, "you're persistent. I only wish you'd find something worth persisting with." "Perhaps I have," Purbright replied, taking a seat. "Mr. Howe's hospital visit, for example. It seems he wasn't there at all." Tooley blinked. "But he told me. Oh dear, that's awkward, isn't it? I'm sure there's a simple explanation. A change of plan, perhaps." "Perhaps," Purbright agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Did he seem agitated that evening?" The vicar thought for a moment. "He was preoccupied. I assumed he was troubled by parish matters. The youth group has been restless." "I see. And Mr. Cribshaw, has he called again?" A faint sigh. "Yes, this morning. He wanted to inspect the offertory box. He's developed an anxiety about miscounted coins. He said the church mustn't be found wanting in stewardship." Purbright smiled gently. "A comforting ambition, if selectively applied." He rose to go. "If I may suggest, Reverend, lock the church properly tonight. I have a feeling someone may wish to revisit it." It was near dusk when Purbright and Mally settled themselves in the shadow of the churchyard wall, a thermos and patience between them. The lamps in the square had begun to glow, dim halos in the mist. A dog barked once, far off, then fell silent. From inside the church came the faint creak of wood cooling, the sigh of old air. Around 9 o'clock, the vestry door opened. A thin line of yellow light spilled across the path. A figure moved, small, cloaked, hesitant. Purbright touched Mally's arm lightly. "Now we shall see who prefers prayer after dark," he whispered. The figure paused by the confessional, knelt, and seemed to search along the floor. A gloved hand reached into the narrow bench space. Then, as though startled by its own guilt, it withdrew sharply. Purbright stepped forward, the gravel betraying him. The figure spun round, gasped, and dropped something that rang softly against the stone. "Good evening, Mrs. Viney," Purbright said calmly. The church cleaner stood frozen, her face pale under her hat. Oh, Inspector, you frightened me out of a year's Sundays. My apologies. I might ask what brings you to your duties at this hour. I came for my key, she stammered. Left it here after polishing the lectern. In the confessional. Purbright's voice was kind, but his eyes missed nothing. A curious place to lose it. Her hands twisted in her apron. Well, it might have slipped down. Mally bent and picked up a small object from the floor. It was not a key, but a cartridge casing. Purbright regarded it for a long moment, then looked at her. Mrs. Viney, he said gently, shall we step outside? I think the air will do us all good. In the misty lamplight, her composure began to crumble. I didn't mean any harm, she whispered. I only wanted to be sure it was gone. Gone? Purbright echoed softly. You mean the gun? She nodded, trembling. He told me to hide it, said it would only bring trouble if it were found. I didn't know it was already loaded. Who told you? But Mrs. Viney's answer was swallowed by the sudden tolling of the church bell, its echo spreading through the square like a reprimand. When at last it stopped, she looked at Purbright with frightened, exhausted eyes. The curate, she said faintly. Mr. Howe. He said it belonged to him. Only he couldn't keep it any longer. Purbright's expression did not change, but his gaze drifted toward the dark spire rising over the town, where every secret eventually came to rest in the rafters, before falling, inevitably, to the floor. Purbright's office was still scented faintly of the damp churchyard when he returned there with Mrs. Viney's confession written out in careful, long hand. She had wept a little, dried her tears on a handkerchief that looked older than her decency, and been sent home with instructions to remain available for further questioning. Sergeant Mally, uneasy in the hush that followed, busied himself straightening files and tapping his pencil. So, it's Huff's gun then, sir. Seems straightforward enough now. Straightforward things, Sergeant, Purbright said, taking off his hat, are rarely true. They simply arrive earlier than the truth does. He seated himself, his expression thoughtful but not grim. Still, Mrs. Viney gave us more than she knew. The curate's request to hide the gun tells us he was afraid, but not of the weapon itself. Afraid of what its discovery might prove? Mally frowned. He said it belonged to him, though. Indeed, which is odd for an innocent man. One might expect him to say it was found, borrowed, or even blessed, but not owned. He reached for his pipe, turning it unlit between his fingers. We shall see what young Mr. Howe has to say for himself before breakfast. They found him at the vicarage next morning, standing by the dining-room window in a haze of nervous sunshine. His collar was skewed, his eyes red-rimmed, and the faint scent of stale ink and gilt clung to him. Reverend Tooley, wringing his hands behind him, looked as though he had been praying for everyone and persuading no one. Inspector, Howe began, before Purbright could speak, I suppose Mrs. Viney has told you some story, but it's nonsense, pure misunderstanding. Then we shall misunderstand together, Purbright said pleasantly. You asked her to hide a revolver for you. I may have, Howe admitted, glancing at Tooley, who stared into the teapot. But it isn't what you think. I found the thing in the vestry cupboard weeks ago when we were clearing for the youth service. I didn't know what to do with it, I thought. If I handed it in, people would talk. A gun in the church. Imagine the headlines. So I asked Mrs. Viney to keep it quiet until I could decide. Purbright considered this, his head slightly tilted. And you decided to place it in the confessional? I thought it would be safe there, Howe said miserably. No one ever uses it. That, Purbright murmured, was optimistic. The curate's hands twisted. Then Mrs. Viney went and told you all. Bless her, she means well, but she doesn't think. And now I look like a criminal. Not yet, Purbright said kindly. Merely imaginative. He studied the young man's anxious face, noting the flickers of truth and panic struggling for room. Tell me, did you also write the letters to Reverend Tooley? Howe's mouth opened, then closed. Letters? The anonymous ones, Purbright said, voice soft but unrelenting. I've read them. A fine command of moral outrage, though rather less of spelling. They read, if I may say so, like the work of a man whose zeal exceeds his courage. Ho flushed, an involuntary twitch betraying recognition. I may have written something, he stammered, but only to warn him. I meant no harm. To warn him of what? Of corruption, Ho said fiercely now, as though conviction might rescue him. He lets all sorts into the church. He listens to people who gossip and flirt in God's house. I thought perhaps a stern word would remind him of his duty. Purbright leaned back, studying him with a curious tenderness. And the revolver, Mr. Ho, was that to remind him too? The curate's defiance wilted. No, I swear I didn't use it, didn't even know it was loaded. I only wanted it gone. Reverend Tooley made a small, helpless sound. Inspector, surely he's telling the truth. He's foolish, not wicked. Purbright stood. Possibly both, Reverend, but one mustn't confuse piety with innocence. He left them there, the curate pale and shaking, the vicar looking as though salvation required paperwork. Outside, the fog was lifting from the rooftops, revealing Flaxborough in all its orderly imperfection. At the station, Malley awaited him with another report. Sir, we found something odd in the gun's chamber. Scratches near the firing pin. Like it's been discharged recently, but not here. Purbright took the note, his gaze sharpening. So it has been fired, but elsewhere. Looks that way. And we've had word from the next parish. A farmer reported hearing a single shot on Saturday night, near the canal. Saturday, Purbright repeated, thoughtful. The night before the gun was found. Curious geography for a curate's conscience. Malley hesitated. You think he shot someone, sir? Purbright smiled faintly. No, Sergeant. I think someone wishes us to think so. But what I do believe is that this gun's true journey began long before it reached St. Botolph's. Someone sent it there, wrapped in righteousness, and chose their messengers with care. He glanced at the window, where the sunlight fell weakly through the glass, and added almost to himself, the pistol was planted, Sergeant, not hidden. And I intend to learn for whose benefit. Later, when dusk crept once more across the square, Purbright walked alone past the churchyard railings. He paused by the gate, watching the faint light from the vestry window. The curate's silhouette moved within, bent and uncertain, while somewhere nearby, a figure stood motionless, half-shadowed by the yew trees. Purbright said nothing, merely observed, and when at last the figure slipped away toward the high street, he followed at a distance. The path led, predictably enough, to Mr. Cribshaw's office, the door closing softly behind them. Purbright stopped beneath the gas lamp, a faint smile forming as he noted the connection, the pious and the practical, joined by secrecy. He turned back toward the police station, his pace unhurried. The pieces were moving now, gently and almost politely, but the pattern was beginning to show. By Thursday morning, the town's air had changed, though most of its inhabitants would not have been able to say quite how. The news of Mrs. Viney's late-night wanderings had not reached the cafes. Purbright's discretion saw to that. But there was a nervous energy about St. Botolph's, a tautness beneath the calm. The curate, Mr. Ho, had gone conspicuously about his duties, visiting the sick and counting hymn books, while Reverend Tooley wore the distracted air of a man who suspects his sermons are being read back to him by the police. Purbright, meanwhile, moved with his usual slow certainty, a man watching a kettle that must boil, though not yet. After breakfast, he sent Sergeant Malley to fetch a list of those who rented storage sheds near the canal. If a shot was heard there on Saturday, he said, we may find what was shot, or at least who was shooting. Let's see whose property curiosity might have wandered into. By mid-morning, Malley returned, faintly damp and more than faintly satisfied. "There's an old shed, sir, rented to a Mr. Cribshaw. Says it's for church jumble overflow, but the caretaker swears no jumble's gone in or out since last year. Found boot marks and straw, and something else." He laid a small brown paper packet on the desk. Inside was a scrap of blue velvet, torn, frayed, and faintly perfumed. Purbright regarded it in silence for a moment. "Velvet," he said at last, "and scented. A curious accessory for ecclesiastical donations, unless the Mothers' Union has lately turned to the stage." Malley grinned. "Could be anyone's, sir." "Indeed, but anyone in Flaxborough is seldom everyone. This will belong to someone quite specific, and I rather think I know whose wardrobe it may have brushed." That afternoon, the inspector strolled into the library, where Miss Teatime was engaged in the genteel sport of reorganizing other people's reading choices. Her smile was as polite as the edge of a knife. "Inspector Purbright, I hope your investigations are prospering, or at least entertaining." "They are both, Miss Teatime," he said warmly. "I wonder, have you lately lent a velvet wrap to anyone? Blue, scented, and more worldly than strictly necessary for the reading circle." Her eyes flickered, though her voice remained light. "Why, Inspector, if you've begun cataloguing ladies' garments, the chief constable must be desperate indeed." "Desperation is a luxury I reserve for weekends," Purbright replied. "Still, I ask, because such a wrap, or one very like it, was found near the canal, in a shed belonging to Mr. Cribshaw." Miss Teatime's hand paused mid-shelving. "Cribshaw," she repeated. "Surely you don't imagine he'd any interest in haberdashery?" "None," Purbright said, "though I imagine he takes an interest in those who do. You know him well, I think." "Well enough to dislike him," she said crisply, "a pompous little man who mistakes thrift for virtue. Still, I've had to deal with him at parish events. He calls me a worldly influence, which in his vocabulary is synonymous with not fooled by him." "Then you won't mind if I ask whether he's ever borrowed anything from you, money, for example?" She laughed, though it came out brittle. "He's borrowed conversation, Inspector, which is dearer in the long run. But money?" "No, though," she added thoughtfully. "I once saw him leaving the church at dusk with a lady who wasn't Mrs. Viney, and certainly wasn't the vicar's wife. A little younger, rather nervous-looking. Wore a blue cloak, if memory serves." "Ah," said Purbright quietly. "Blue." He thanked her and left, the scent of old paper and irony lingering in his coat. Back at the station, he sent for the churchwarden. Cribshaw arrived with the wounded dignity of a man summoned by his inferiors. "Really, Inspector," he began, "this constant poking about the parish is doing more harm than good. People are talking." "I rely on it," said Purbright pleasantly. "Sit down, Mr. Cribshaw. I wanted a word about your shed near the canal." Cribshaw's eyes darted. "My shed?" "Oh yes, purely for storage. We keep old hymnals, surplus chairs. Velvet, perhaps?" "Velvet?" His mustache twitched. "Certainly not." Purbright leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps you can explain why a piece of blue velvet, torn and scented, was found there, along with traces suggesting someone recently visited in some haste." The man's color drained. "Inspector, this is ridiculous. I've allowed church property there occasionally. Mrs. Wykes from the Jumble may have—" "Been meeting you?" Purbright finished softly. "Or perhaps she was helping you dispose of something less charitable." Cribshaw sputtered. "I shan't sit here and be insulted." "No," Purbright agreed. "You shall sit here and be honest." For a moment the only sound was the tick of the office clock. Then Cribshaw slumped, defeated more by propriety than threat. "Very well. I've used the shed for private meetings. Nothing criminal, Inspector. Merely personal. I beg your discretion." "With whom?" "Mrs. Wykes," he muttered, "the verger's sister. She has had certain difficulties. I was helping her financially." "Ah, with cash or conscience?" Cribshaw glared, then sighed. "She was in trouble, claimed her husband, long separated, was threatening her. Said he carried a pistol. I wanted to keep her safe, but she panicked and, well, I took the gun from her, meaning to dispose of it. Then I asked young Hope to hold it for me, quietly, until I could decide how best to proceed. He's an impressionable boy and would do anything to please the vestry. Purbright nodded, his expression unreadable. And Saturday night, did you meet Mrs. Wykes? Yes. She was distraught. We argued. She said she'd told someone else about the gun. I left her there by the canal. His voice faltered. I swear she was alive when I went. Purbright stood, the room suddenly close with the weight of revelation. You'll forgive me, Mr. Cribshaw, if I verify that for myself. Sergeant Malley will accompany you home. I imagine you'd rather not walk alone this evening. When the door closed behind them, Purbright remained motionless for a long time, staring at the bit of velvet on his desk. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the glass. Soft, persistent, and promising that before the night was over, something else in Flaxborough would come clean too. The rain thickened as the evening came down, washing the cobbles to a dull gleam and gathering in shallow pools beneath the church wall. Inspector Purbright stood for a while outside the police station, hat pulled low, the faint reflection of the gas lamp trembling in the wet brim. He had sent Sergeant Malley to see that Mr. Cribshaw reached home and stayed there. The churchwarden's confession, half moral panic, half self-preservation, had the shape of truth, yet left too much unsaid. People in Flaxborough often told the truth the way they baked scones, carefully, but leaving a hollow in the middle. Inside, the station clock nudged past 9 when Malley returned, damp and hesitant. He's home, sir, he reported, shut himself in with the curtains drawn. But there's more. He placed a folded paper on the desk. Mrs. Wykes. She's been found. Purbright looked up slowly. Alive? Malley shook his head. No, sir. A bargeman spotted her this evening, downstream by the weir. Looks like she fell or was pushed in sometime Saturday night. Doctor says there's a bruise on the back of her skull. The inspector's face remained still, though a small sigh escaped him, as if the inevitable had merely confirmed itself. Then our pistol's purpose was not symbolic after all, he said quietly. And our curate's role, though foolish, may prove secondary to someone else's intention. He rose, taking his coat. Come along, Sergeant. Let's go and see the lady's peace restored. The canal lay under a sheen of mist, the barges moored like dozing animals. Lanterns wobbled on the water, throwing soft, broken halos across the reeds. Mrs. Wykes had been brought to the towpath, a sad, small figure covered neatly with a tarpaulin by men who had seen too much of the river's mischief. The doctor, collar turned up, nodded gravely as they approached. She's been in the water since late Saturday. The bruise might have come from the fall, but I'd say she was struck first. Not a hard blow, but enough to daze her. Purbright bent, lifting the edge of the covering just enough to look. The face was pale, softened by water, but not by peace. Around her neck still clung a faint trace of that same perfume caught in the velvet scrap. He let the cloth fall back gently. A pity, he murmured. She seems to have been a woman who attracted both help and harm with equal efficiency. Malley cleared his throat. We'll bring her in, sir. Yes, and be discreet. I imagine half the town's already watching from behind curtains. By the time they returned to the station, the news had begun its inevitable pilgrimage. Reverend Tooley, white-faced, arrived soon after, clutching his hat like a relic. Inspector, is it true? Mrs. Wykes, dead. Oh, dear heaven. Drowned, Purbright said. Probably after a struggle. You knew her? Of course. She was a decent woman, troubled but faithful. She often helped at the jumble. Mr. Cribshaw said she'd left town to stay with a cousin. I dare say he believed it, Purbright replied, his tone almost gentle. But she didn't get far. Tell me, Reverend, did she ever come to you with her troubles? She hinted, Tooley admitted. Said she was afraid of her husband. though I gathered he'd been gone for years. There was talk of a letter she'd received. Threatening, she said. But she tore it up. I thought it the exaggeration of loneliness. Loneliness exaggerates, yes, Purbright said softly. But it also notices what others overlook. He regarded the vicar thoughtfully. Reverend, I must ask, did she ever mention Mr. Howe? Tooley blinked. The curate? Good gracious, no. Why, he hardly spoke to her except in passing. She was closer to Cribshaw, poor woman. Closer than he found convenient, Purbright murmured. Thank you, Reverend. Try to get some rest. When Tooley had gone, Mally said quietly, So, sir, Cribshaw lied about leaving her alive. Not necessarily, Purbright replied. He may well have left her breathing. The question is who came after. A man who hides behind other people's respectability seldom does his own killing. There's someone else in this. Someone who thinks moral indignation grants immunity. He turned toward the window, where rain whispered against the glass. We'll visit Mr. Howe in the morning, Sergeant, and perhaps before the day is done, St. Botolph's will have heard its final confession of this affair. The morning broke with pale sunlight, cold but cleansing. Purbright found the curate in the church, on his knees before the altar rail, though his posture suggested more exhaustion than piety. He started when the inspector's voice broke the silence. Prayer can be an excellent rehearsal for honesty, Mr. Howe. The young man rose, pale and trembling. Inspector, please, you don't think I had anything to do with that poor woman's death? I think you've been used, Mr. Howe, Purbright said quietly, by a man clever enough to see your conscience as a tool. Mr. Cribshaw needed someone easily persuaded to keep a dangerous secret. You obliged him, but secrets grow heavier the longer they're kept. Ho swallowed. He told me she was being blackmailed. He said the gun was proof against her husband, nothing more. I didn't know, didn't believe. Purbright studied him. And when you learned she was dead? The curate's eyes filled. I heard the gossip this morning. God forgive me, I was relieved. Relieved that it was over. That's my sin, Inspector. Not murder, but cowardice. Cowardice, Purbright said, is rarely terminal, but silence often is. He turned toward the vestry door. If you wish to be useful now, you'll find Mr. Cribshaw at home. You might suggest he call upon me this afternoon. He won't, of course, but it will make him nervous, and nervous men tidy their guilt in the most revealing ways. That evening, as the church bell tolled 6, Purbright stood again by the window of his office. The rain had ceased, and the first dry wind of autumn moved through the streets. Mally entered, carrying a message slip. From the constable at Cribshaw's house, sir. He says the front door's open. No answer to knocking. Purbright took his hat. Then let's not keep him waiting. I suspect, Sergeant, the good churchwarden has begun a confession of his own, and I'd rather not leave him alone with it too long. The lamplight outside flickered uncertainly as they stepped into the night. The town watching once more through half-closed curtains, waiting for the next small revelation in its quietly scandalous peace. The Cribshaw residence was one of those houses that wore its respectability too tightly, its curtains drawn with military precision, brass door knocker polished to a sermon's gleam. Not a geranium daring to bloom beyond the limits of propriety. Yet as Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Mally approached through the damp dusk, there was a peculiar stillness about it. The front gate stood ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. From somewhere within came the muffled sound of a clock ticking, steady, untroubled, and horribly indifferent. Purbright knocked once, twice. When no reply came, he pushed the door open and stepped into a hallway that smelled faintly of lavender polish and something sharper, metallic. Cribshaw, he called softly. His voice carried up the narrow staircase, where shadows leaned in close, listening. They found him in the study. The room was in perfect order, as if tidied for company, except for the man himself, slumped sideways in the leather chair. The revolver lay neatly on the blotter beside him, one chamber spent. His eyes were half open, fixed on the decanter across the desk as though he'd been judging whether to pour another before deciding otherwise. Mally let out a quiet breath. "Well, sir, that answers one question." "It usually does," Purbright murmured, stepping closer. He examined the scene without haste. The single gunshot wound, the lack of disturbance, the deliberate positioning. Everything about it spoke of planning, but not necessarily despair. "Fetch the doctor," he said, "and have the constable keep this room untouched. I don't like suicides that tidy up after themselves." When the doctor arrived and confirmed what was already clear, Purbright dismissed the formalities with a polite nod. "Self-inflicted," the doctor said with a certainty bred from habit. "Clean, close range. He must have regretted something terribly." Purbright smiled faintly. "I imagine he did. The only question is what or whom." Later, after the body was removed and the house secured, Purbright lingered alone in the study. The lamplight played softly across the papers on the desk. Bank statements, receipts, and a half-written letter. He picked it up, reading the cramped, self-conscious script aloud to himself. "My dear Reverend, by the time you read this, I shall have made my peace. It was never my intention that things should go so far. She became frightened, and I could not reason with her. The gun was never meant for harm. God forgive me for my weakness." Purbright read it twice, then folded it neatly again. It was the sort of letter meant to end an inquiry rather than explain it. Convenient, measured, and suspiciously prompt. He looked toward the window, where the curtains moved slightly with the draft. "You weren't the sort for gestures, were you, Cribshaw?" he said quietly. "You preferred other people to do your dramatics." At that moment, Mally returned, hat in hand. "Neighbors say they heard a car earlier, about an hour before we arrived. Engine stopped out front for a minute, then drove off." "Did they notice who was in it?" "No, sir. Too dark. But Mrs. Dutton next door thought she saw a woman's shape through the windscreen." Purbright nodded slowly. "A woman, yes. They often appear in the footnotes of tragedies written by men who take themselves too seriously. Have the road checked for tire prints in the morning, if the rain spares us." He stepped out into the night. The rain had begun again, soft as apology. Flaxborough lay hushed, every window curtained, every conscience quietly awake. He and Mally walked in silence until they reached the corner by the churchyard. The faint glow of St. Bartolph's lamps shone through the mist, turning the headstones into a congregation of eavesdroppers. "Strange end for a churchwarden," Mally said at last. "Strange, yes," Purbright agreed, "but not untypical. Guilt here is like damp. It spreads quietly until it finds a wall unpainted." "Think he killed her, then?" Purbright's gaze remained fixed on the dark tower above. "No. He was a man of petty deceits, not violent ones. I think he believed himself responsible because that's what cowards do. They mistake negligence for sin. But there's someone else still walking comfortably about with murder tucked away like a hymn book." The next morning brought a rare brightness, though the town's mood remained low. The papers would print nothing. The vicar's discreet plea to the editor ensured that. But word of Cribshaw's death ran through Flaxborough in the mild tone reserved for news that was both tragic and convenient. Mrs. Glossop declared it proof that respectability leads to nerves, while Miss Teatime merely remarked that some men tidy themselves off the stage better than they ever managed on it. Purbright spent the morning in the vestry, alone. The confessional stood open, sunlight catching the grain of the oak panels. He rested a hand against the worn wood, listening to the silence that lived there. Somewhere beneath it lay the heartbeat of the case, the rhythm of deceit, fear, and the tidy little death of a conscience. As he turned to leave, his eye caught a small shape on the ledge beneath the window, a lace-edged handkerchief, faintly scented, monogrammed with a single M. He lifted it delicately, studying the neat embroidery, the faint smear of powder on one corner. Miss Teatime had always claimed to despise melodrama, but Purbright remembered her expression when the blue velvet had been mentioned. Too controlled, too practiced. The woman's shape in the car could have been anyone, but the scent on the handkerchief was unmistakably hers. He placed it carefully into his pocket and stepped out into the pale daylight, his expression mild, almost genial. The choir's distant practice drifted from the parish hall, tuneless but oddly fitting. "Sergeant," he said as he rejoined Mally outside, "we'll pay Miss Teatime a visit this afternoon. It's time we asked her whether her reading habits have lately included detective fiction or something rather nearer to experience." And as they walked through the quiet square, the clock on the town hall struck noon, its measured chime falling over Flaxborough like a reminder that, however late the truth might arrive, it was always punctual in the end. It was a little past 2 when Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Mally arrived at Miss Teatime's house, a narrow building with lace curtains so precise they could have been measured by compass. The front garden was obediently weeded, the geraniums arranged in what seemed to be a strategic defense against spontaneity. When Purbright rang the bell, a faint rustle suggested someone had been standing just behind the door, listening. "Inspector," Miss Teatime's voice, when she opened, was warm but wary, her eyes a fraction too alert. "How nice, though I must say, unexpected. One doesn't often receive visits from the police before tea." "I like to get ahead of the gossip," Purbright said, removing his hat. "May we come in? It's a fine afternoon for untangling things." She hesitated a moment too long, then stepped aside. "Do bring your boots over the mat, Sergeant. Mud leaves such an impression." The sitting room was just as Purbright expected, tidy to the point of choreography, with scent lingering in the air like a well-rehearsed alibi. He saw on a side table a stack of library books, all titles having to do with crime, morality, or both. "Still reading the classics, I see," he remarked. "I do admire a person who keeps their instruction varied." Miss Teatime smiled, the edge of it sharp. "Better the company of murderers on paper than in person, Inspector." "Indeed. And yet one does sometimes find the two overlap." He took a seat without invitation, watching her settle opposite. The faintest tremor of annoyance passed through her composure. "Tell me," he began, "were you acquainted with Mrs. Wykes?" "Acquainted," she repeated, pausing to pour tea into fragile cups. "In a village sense, naturally. She helped occasionally with the church sales. A rather nervous woman, always struck me as someone playing at respectability and doing it badly." "Interesting," said Purbright mildly. "I ask because something of hers, or at least something linked to her, was found in your company. A small handkerchief, monogrammed with a rather distinctive scent." Her hand paused halfway to the saucer. The teacup clinked lightly. "You're mistaken," she said at last. "That must belong to someone else." "It might," Purbright agreed. "But the same scent was found on a scrap of velvet recovered from Mr. Cribshaw's shed near the canal, and unless the church jumble has adopted perfume as a form of blessing, I can only assume the owner had reason to be there." Miss Teatime's eyes narrowed just enough to betray calculation. "You're implying something rather serious, Inspector." "Not implying," Purbright said gently. "Following." She sat back, recovering her poise. "Very well, then. If it interests you so greatly, I was at the shed. Briefly. Mr. Cribshaw asked me to meet him there on Saturday evening. He said he wished to discuss a private matter of conscience, something about funds for the church roof. I went, foolishly, out of curiosity. He was agitated, talking nonsense about letters, about being watched. Then that woman arrived, Mrs. Wykes, and there was an argument. I left immediately. Whatever happened afterward, I had no part in it." Purbright regarded her with quiet admiration. "A tidy account, Miss Teatime. You've managed to make yourself appear both innocent and indispensable." Her chin lifted. "I'm neither fool nor coward, Inspector. But I won't be dragged through gossip to satisfy Flaxborough's appetite for scandal." "Quite so," Purbright said, standing. "Still, I must ask, why did you not come forward after learning of Mrs. Wykes's death?" "Because," she said with sudden sharpness, "I doubted. It would matter. The truth rarely does in this town. People prefer their lies properly ironed." He smiled faintly. "Then I must beg your indulgence to crease them a little. Should you recall any further detail, something small, perhaps about that quarrel, do let me know. Small things, after all, have a way of rearranging the furniture of a case." When they left, Mally exhaled as if released from an exam. "You think she's our killer, sir?" "Not yet," Purbright said, walking down the narrow path. "But she's a better storyteller than Cribshaw ever was. And storytellers tend to leave their endings open until someone else closes them." He paused at the gate. "Notice anything, Sergeant?" Mally looked back. "The curtains, sir. Drawn, though it's bright out." "Exactly. People who hide from light always forget that light also shines in." They returned to the station as dusk crept across the rooftops. A message awaited them, an urgent note from the pathologist. The revolver found near Cribshaw bore traces of oil inconsistent with the rest of his study. The fingerprints were blurred, but a faint impression of a smaller, gloved hand had been preserved along the barrel. Purbright read it twice, then placed it neatly aside. "A gloved hand," he murmured. "Not Cribshaw's, then. He was too proud to wear gloves for anything less than gardening. And Miss Tea Time, if I recall, always carries a pair for visiting the library after dusk." Mally frowned. "You think she shot him?" "I think," Purbright said slowly, "she found him already dead, or dying, and saw an opportunity. Perhaps he'd written something that placed her nearer to that shed than she wished. A letter can be silenced as surely as a witness." He lit his pipe, the smoke rising in a lazy spiral. "But there's a grace to her manner that tells me she didn't pull any trigger. She'd have preferred poison, something quieter, something with style." Outside, the church bell struck 8. The sound floated through the damp evening air like a reminder that no one in Flaxborough could hide from decency for long. Purbright leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "No," he murmured. "Our murderer hasn't been revealed yet. They're still somewhere between guilt and gossip, waiting for the wrong word to betray them." Mally shifted uneasily. "And where do we start looking, sir?" Purbright smiled, the faintest gleam of amusement behind his calm. "Where we always do, Sergeant, among those most eager to help tidy up. Murder, like charity, so often begins in the parish." The following morning arrived pale and listless, as if even the weather had grown cautious of adding drama to Flaxborough's affairs. Inspector Purbright was at his desk early, pipe in hand and eyes half on the window, where a faint drizzle traced uncertain paths down the glass. The town beyond looked washed clean but not renewed. Just quietly waiting. Sergeant Mally came in with the day's post and a frown that had clearly been warming since breakfast. "Report from the lab, sir," he said, setting an envelope down. "That partial glove print, female, small, recent, and the oil they found on the revolver, from the type used to clean brass fixtures." Purbright raised his eyebrows. "Brass, you say? How very ecclesiastical. Mrs. Viney's polish, I suppose." Mally hesitated. "Could be. Or anyone with church keys and housekeeping habits." "Quite so," said Purbright, tapping his pipe stem lightly against the desk. "Do we know who last handled the lectern or the communion rail before the Sunday service?" "Mrs. Viney again, but she swears she never touched the gun." "Everyone swears something, Sergeant. The trick is discovering to what they're actually swearing." He stood and stretched, moving with deliberate calm. "I think it's time we visited the church one more time. There are still 1 or 2 pews of truth we've left unsat in." St. Botolph's stood quiet under the drizzle, its spire poking at the colorless sky like an accusation. Inside, the air was damp, scented with polish and faintly of lilies. Mrs. Viney's doing, without doubt. She was there now, bent over the brass candlesticks, rubbing industriously, her lips moving in a rhythm of muttered efficiency. "Morning, Mrs. Viney," said Purbright gently. "We're almost becoming part of your cleaning routine." She straightened, flustered but proud. "Good morning, sir. Well, the Lord's house won't keep itself." "No, indeed," Purbright said. "You've been most faithful in that regard. Tell me, was it you who found the vicar's letter from Mr. Cribshaw yesterday?" Her cloth froze mid-polish. "Letter? What letter?" Purbright watched her face closely. "Ah, I see you hadn't heard. A letter left for Reverend Tooley. He hadn't opened it yet when I arrived this morning." "Odd, really. The envelope was in the vestry post tray, addressed but not sealed." Her lips pressed tight. "I never saw it." "Then I dare say someone meant you not to." He smiled faintly, offering her a small kindness in his tone. "You've helped a great many people, Mrs. Viney. Mr. Howe, the vicar, even Mr. Cribshaw, but sometimes help turns into something heavier. Tell me, did Mr. Cribshaw ever ask you to deliver messages for him?" Her hands trembled slightly, but she held the cloth steady. "He did once or twice. Notes for Mr. Howe, mostly. Church matters," he said. "Saturday night among them?" "No." She said it too quickly, then quieter. "Well, he came by that afternoon, left a parcel. Said it was for the curate. Told me not to mention it. I didn't open it." Purbright exchanged a glance with Mally. "And did the curate ever receive that parcel?" "I left it in the vestry cupboard like he told me," she said, eyes darting toward the confessional. "When I came back Sunday morning, it was gone." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "And soon after, you found the gun in the confessional." Her face twitched. "You don't think—" "I think," he said gently, "someone used you as the most convenient servant of their scheme. That parcel may well have contained the revolver. But what interests me most is not the weapon itself. It's who knew you'd be too decent to question it." He turned, pacing slowly down the aisle. Mr. Cribshaw was frightened, too frightened to confront Mrs. Wykes himself after their quarrel. Someone else went to that meeting by the canal in his place. Someone clever enough to use his name. Mrs. Viney whispered, "But who would do such a thing?" Someone with a grievance both moral and personal. Someone who knew of Mrs. Wykes's connection to Cribshaw, and who despised both for it. Purbright stopped before the altar rail, looking up at the chancel as though it might answer him. "Someone," he said softly, "who wrote anonymous letters to the vicar, and later wished those letters, and their author, forgotten." Mally frowned. "But that would mean—" "Yes," Purbright said. "Our earnest young curate." That evening, as the rain thinned to mist, they found Mr. Howe at the vicarage, packing books into a suitcase. He looked up as they entered, startled but not surprised. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I suppose you've come to arrest me." Purbright shook his head. "Not if talking will serve instead. You see, Mr. Howe lies in Flaxborough rarely last past Vespers. They have nowhere to hide." The curate's shoulders sagged. "I never meant to kill her," he said, voice breaking. "I only wanted to frighten her, to make her stop. She was threatening to expose everything. She'd written to the bishop, claiming I'd betrayed my vows. It wasn't true, but she'd have ruined me all the same." "So you took the gun," Purbright said softly. "I went to the shed that night to plead with her. She laughed at me, said she'd tell the whole town. I lost my temper. I struck her, only once. She fell, God forgive me, she fell and hit her head. The rest, I panicked. I thought if they found the gun near the church, they'd think it was Cribshaw's doing." "You planted it in the confessional," Purbright finished for him. Howe nodded, tears streaking his face. "I didn't even realize she was dead until the next day. When they said she'd drowned, I prayed it might be true. That she'd only run." Purbright regarded him for a long moment. "You've prayed enough, Mr. Howe. Now you must tell the truth plainly." and let that do the rest. When the young man was led away, Reverend Tooley stood silent by the door, his face ashen. "I should have seen it," he murmured. He was so earnest, so sure of everyone else's failings. Purbright placed his hat on his head. "The trouble with righteousness, Reverend," he said gently, "is that it blinds its owners to the size of their own shadow." He stepped out into the misty street, the church bell marking the hour behind him, slow and deliberate. Flaxborough was quiet again, but not yet at peace. There was one chapter left to write, and Purbright, ever the patient craftsman, intended it to end as tidily as the town itself demanded. By the next morning, Flaxborough had resumed its customary rhythm of subdued gossip and carefully edited sympathy. The curate's arrest was the talk of every breakfast table, though always under the guise of concern for the vicar's poor nerves. Reverend Tooley, for his part, bore the ordeal with the resigned composure of a man who had long suspected sin lurked even in the hymn-book cupboard. The church bells tolled as usual that Sunday, though to some ears their chime sounded slightly out of tune, as if the town itself were uncertain what to make of redemption. Inspector Purbright attended the service, not out of piety, but politeness. He preferred to see a case through to its quiet burial, and St. Botolph's provided a suitable metaphor. The congregation's whispers swirled around him like autumn leaves. Talk of confession, letters, and the young curate's fall from grace. Purbright noted, with faint amusement, how swiftly guilt became a matter of community property. Every citizen of Flaxborough now possessed their own version of the truth, and all were certain of their accuracy. After the service, he found Reverend Tooley standing in the vestry, gazing at the empty confessional as though half expecting it to breathe. "It feels wrong, Inspector," the vicar murmured. "To be grateful that a mystery is solved, yet ashamed that it happened here." "Every mystery ends in some form of shame," Purbright said gently. "Otherwise, it would not be a mystery, but a misunderstanding." Tooley sighed. "And poor Hoof, I cannot help thinking he believed himself righteous even as he sinned." Purbright's expression softened. "Righteousness is the most dangerous disguise for fear, Reverend. He mistook conscience for calling, and when cornered, the two are indistinguishable." As the vicar busied himself with the collection books, Purbright turned his gaze toward the confessional's small window, where a weak shaft of light filtered through the glass. It struck the worn wood like an accusation polished by time. There was something almost comforting in its familiarity. Flaxborough's sins, like its silver, were always well maintained. He left the church and walked toward the square, where Sergeant Malley was waiting by the police car, holding a paper bag that suggested bakery involvement. "Morning, sir," Malley said, offering a respectful nod and, less reverently, a sausage roll. "The curate's made a full statement. He's not fighting it. Says he'll plead guilty." Purbright accepted the roll with a faint smile. A small mercy for the legal system, though not for his soul. Malley hesitated. "Still hard to believe, sir. All that talk of morals and letters. Turns out he was writing to himself in a way, wasn't he? Trying to keep his own halo polished." "Precisely, Sergeant," Purbright said. "A man too concerned with other people's stains rarely notices his own shirt is on fire." They stood for a while, watching the townsfolk pass. Mrs. Viney bustling toward the grocer's with renewed vigor, Miss Teatime at her window pretending not to be curious, and a pair of altar boys kicking a football with unholy enthusiasm across the green. The ordinary world, having briefly paused for scandal, was resuming its respectable business. Malley cleared his throat. "Funny thing, sir. After all that fuss about letters and warnings, the real clue was just a bit of brass polish on a gun." Purbright's eyes twinkled. "Most truths are like polish, Sergeant, meant to shine but apt to smear when handled by the wrong hands. Still, I suppose we should be grateful. The simplest details are usually the only honest ones." They returned to the station, where paperwork awaited like an unamused deity. Purbright settled behind his desk, the room thick with the quiet satisfaction of closure. He lit his pipe, then opened the final report, rereading it not for fact, but for tone. He disliked cases ending without dignity. Everything aligned. Mrs. Wykes's death accidental but precipitated by anger, the pistol traced to Cribshaw's jumble shed, Cribshaw's suicide an act of cowardice rather than guilt, and young House's confession a last surrender to conscience. Each piece of the puzzle had found its place, and yet, as always, there remained a faint unease, an understanding that the real crime in Flaxborough was not passion, but pretense. In the margin of his report, Purbright wrote one final line. The sin was pride, wearing the vestments of virtue. He underlined it once, then closed the file. Outside, the church clock struck noon. Through the open window drifted the faint hum of the market and the smell of baking bread. Life in Flaxborough, irrepressibly practical, had moved on. The scandal would fade into anecdote, then into memory, then into silence, until, as always, the next small irregularity disturbed the town's pattern of gentle deceit. Purbright leaned back, exhaling a slow plume of smoke that curled upward like a benediction. "And so," he murmured, to no one in particular, "order restored, illusion preserved, and human nature unrepentant. A tidy week's work." He smiled faintly, reached for his pen to begin the next routine report, and thought, with quiet irony, that in Flaxborough even redemption was subject to the usual committee approval.